I think it's important to make a series like this, because at a moment when intense commitments to different forms of monotheistic religion have now acquired, or rather reacquired, such an intense political connotation, it's important to indicate that the widespread suspicion of disbelief is becoming a real threat to free thought. It isn't as if atheism were a small religious sect. In fact, it's not another form of religious belief at all. And it's important to understand that disbelievers constitute a much larger percentage of the population than religious people, and especially politically motivated religious people, would like to think.
I haven't believed in Christianity, I haven't believed in any religious doctrine since I was 17 or 18.
I never really believed it, and I always thought that all of the religious services at school were ludicrous. Loved the hymns, but the content of the hymns were so absurd, dense theology, weird stuff.
I am one God, and if you don't worship me, you will burn forever. I always thought that was ugly.
They felt that science would be a corrosive to religious belief, and they were worried about it. And damn it, I think they were right. It is corrosive of religious belief, and it's a good thing, too.
I remember sort of trying hard to keep up with it, going to some sort of religious meeting, and I just was sitting and listening to it. I thought, this is a load of rubbish. I just don't think this is true anymore.
I was born in England, but my grandparents came here from Lithuania as Jewish refugees. And for Jews, spread as they are across the world, their religion has always seemed an essential part of their cultural identity. Well, this is the first time in almost 60 years that I've visited a place of worship for anything other than sightseeing. And when I first came here, it was in the name of religion, though not with any religious motive on my part. The fact is, I was sent here by a Jewish father, sent here because he thought that I owed it to what he called my people. And the reason is that quite suddenly, because he had been so appalled about what had happened in the Holocaust and guilty about having escaped it, that he felt that he and I owed some sort of identification with the group. Throughout the war, from 1940, at which time I was 6, until 1945 or 46, I don't really think that I knew or really understood that I was Jewish. When my father said that I was, I didn't really know what he meant. I came here to several services when I was about 11 or 12 on what were called the high holidays. But I came here without knowing what I was participating in. It was conducted in a foreign language which I didn't understand, written in text I couldn't even read. There was singing, but the singing was completely different to the singing with which I had grown much more familiar by virtue of the fact that I was a prep school boy and attended Christian prayers. So I found myself sitting right at the very back here, as far as I could from the main action, amongst a group of people with whom I felt no particular identity, in spite of what my father told me about my identity. And I stuck it out here during the services as long as I could, wondering just how long I'd have to stay before I could return and satisfy my father that I had in fact attended. Well, my atheism, if that's what one insists on calling it, was not at any point a rejection of anything. What I was being introduced to scarcely seemed to be something against which I had to rebel. This all happened at a time when I simply felt myself to be an English schoolboy. The only thing that I was rebelling against was, well, it certainly wasn't the dogma or the doctrine, because that was completely inaccessible to me, and I hadn't been introduced to it earlier. It was simply that coming here on those occasions took up time when I might otherwise be enjoying myself playing cricket. And to be honest, I didn't feel alone in this. I suppose there were lots of boys for whom religion, Christian or Jewish, must have meant something. But my closer friends and I spent no time at all thinking about gods of any kind. Perhaps I was too dumb, or just too interested in cricket or in girls to ask myself any questions about religion. If I had not been, I might have inevitably asked myself questions that have troubled skeptics and unbelievers for as long as men and women have been skeptical or have lacked belief. Is there really no God? And if there really is no supernatural dimension to the universe, why have so many people throughout history and in so many different cultures thought there was? The problem, as I've already said, is that there are so many different forms of skepticism, disbelief and free thought that it's quite hard to do a straightforward history of it, as if it were something that simply grew to become the fully formed thing we know today. In any case, what it is to be an atheist is itself very complex and very questionable. The word is like atypical or asymmetrical. The word atheist simply means not really theist, and that of course begs the question, well, what is a theist? Oddly enough, it's quite difficult to find a simple, straightforward history of atheism on the religious shelves of your local bookshop. And although the subject is dealt with at considerable length in some of the more scholarly works, it soon becomes apparent that in contrast to each of the three monotheistic religions whose articles of faith are explicitly affirmed from the outset and continue to be expressed throughout their subsequent development, it's quite difficult to identify a correspondingly explicit current of denial. In the case of Christianity, for example, for more than 1,000 years after its establishment, you'd be hard put to recognize an openly skeptical rebuttal of its supernatural claims. And that's hardly surprising when you consider the cruel penalties which were often inflicted upon anyone convicted of subversive disbelief. Paradoxically, some of the sources of disbelief are to be found amongst the arguments of believers. It's important to understand that Christianity was constantly redesigning its own dogma, and theologians often formulated the most dangerously skeptical arguments in their effort to test the impregnability of their own faith. And in doing so, they unknowingly furnished atheists with ready-made weapons. Now, what we're talking about here is disbelief. And that's a notion which presupposes something which it contradicts, in other words, belief. Because, well, in the absence of belief, the whole idea of disbelief would be unintelligible. So if we're going to trace a history of the various things that we call atheism, we have to understand what we mean when we use the word belief. So I'd like to jump in to what you might regard as the shallow end and consider simply some of the ways in which we talk about belief.